Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, your guide to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Prepcast. We are running out of these little quotes to tell you why we are such a good PMP exam training program. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. In this episode, we are going to review the tasks and domain skills that you need to know for your PMP exam on Domain 5, closing the project. At the end of this lesson, you should know what PMI will test you on in the 200 questions that you're going to have to answer. But you already know all of this because this is the fifth and last time that we are seeing the same learning goals. And it's the same for the lesson focus here. You've seen this before, and you should know now that the focus of this lesson is the closing domain and that we will be reviewing content tasks, ethics, and domain skills. Let's go for the overview. In regards to the numbers, the closing domain is an interesting domain. Because even though it's the smallest when it comes to the percentages and the questions, 8% of the questions, that's 16 questions will come from this domain, so the smallest of all of them, even though that is the case, it has more tasks and more domain-specific skills than many of the others. I think this is to show that the closing domain, even though it's small, has very important items that we just simply cannot forget as we are managing our project. So what then is the focus here in this domain? Well, we want to get our deliverables accepted. We want to hand them over to the customer. And that's where now the big focus is here. We want to perform lessons learned and we want to measure project success. And I think if you ask the general populace, what do you do as you are closing a project, they will probably talk about the first two bullets, but the lessons learned and measuring project success, that's probably something that most people who are not project managers would not consider as being part of this domain. From my perspective, the closing domain has the most interesting domain-specific knowledge and skills, because some of these, they simply go beyond what you can expect to be taught in a PMP exam prep training course, which means that you won't find anything about these in the Project Management Prepcast. From the list that you see here, they are the basic project accounting principles, archiving techniques and statutes, as well as compliance for statutes and the organizations. These we touch upon maybe, but we don't really discuss them in much detail because, as in the case of accounting principle, this is simply beyond the curriculum of what the Prepcast can and does want to offer to you. But even more interesting is the last bullet, transition planning techniques, because this is part of the PMBOK guide, but while the PMBOK guide discusses transitioning, it doesn't really talk about the technique. So let's do a quick overview of transition planning techniques. Let us begin with our usual definition of what the transition planning technique is. It is here to plan and coordinate the resources that we need on the project in order to deploy the project within the predicted cost, time, and quality estimates. Two facts here to know. The first one is the goal of a successful transition plan is to manage change. And a nice transition plan will have everything in it that is essential to manage this change. Remember, our project introduces change into your business. There was something the way it was done before. Our project is initiated to make a change to this, and then we have something new, a changed process, for instance, at the end. And the goal of the transition plan is to ensure that we move from the old to the new in a planned, structured way. Ideally, The transition plan starts during the due diligence phase. So when we begin basically with project initiation, we start thinking about transitioning. And the framework for the transition plan is hopefully in place by the time the contract is signed with the client. The reason for this is quite simple. If you don't think about this very early on, it is going to get forgotten. And that's why we want to do this as early as possible, planning for the actual transition. And I've pretty much already taken away where on the project you are going to be using transition planning techniques. You use it during project planning while you set it up, and then in the close project or phase process in the PMBOK guide. And here, in fact, it is an output, and the PMBOK guide calls it the final product, service, or result transition. That's what it is per definition in the PMBOK guide. Here we have a few steps, a few ingredients to think about when we're talking about the transition planning, creating one. You have to think about key personnels, their duties and their responsibilities. For instance, who will be training, who will be handing over the deliverables, who will be receiving the deliverables. Is there anybody whom we have to inform? We have to have a transition strategy in place. Who is going to be doing what? Why are we handing certain items over to person A and not to person B? So that's what goes into the strategy. We have to have a transition timeline. When are we going to start transitioning? Are we really starting the transition at the very end of the project? Or are we going to start training people midway through so that transitioning begins halfway through the project, integrating people sooner and more often? Of course, everything has to be documented, everything has to be communicated, and there you go again, we need to have some training. And one thing is certain, risks are going to come up. You are starting out with the transition planning techniques at the very beginning of the project, and only at the end will you hand it over. Well, guess what's going to happen in the meantime? Things will change. Maybe the deliverables, the way they were envisioned at the very beginning, the way they were integrated into the transition plan, at the end, they may look differently. So you are going to have to think about the risk of the transitioning during the project, and it's something that you're going to have to revisit again and again. That's not just something you do at the beginning or at the end. It's something you will have to revisit. All right, so much for our little journey down the alley called transition planning techniques. Let's now come back to the main focus of our lesson here, which is going through the individual tasks that you will be tested on in the PMP exam according to the PMP exam content outline. In task 1, here in the closing domain, you obtain final acceptance of the project deliverables by working with the sponsor and or the customer in order to confirm that the project scope and deliverables were met. Task 1 in this domain is rather interesting because this task is actually more like an initiation of the closing domain, because this is supposed to happen before you can close. In essence, by executing this task here, you are asking the question, can we close the project? And of course, it isn't you who decides that. It's the customer who decides whether or not we can close the project. You play a major role in the process because you have to work with the customer or sponsor to determine if everything was delivered to their satisfaction. And if you planned your project correctly, this means that you created acceptance criteria and product validations in the planning stages of the project. Now here in task 1, let's call this the pre-closing task if you wish, you look at each deliverable, compare it to its acceptance or validation criteria, and then you know if you can continue with closing or if you have to do another round of executing. In regards to ethics, let's think about where we are on our project. We're near the end. So both time and money are probably nearly used up, and there might be a tendency on our part to push our customer and sponsor a bit harder to agree. We are ready to close. Let us close this project. So let's now concentrate on the bad behaviors that we could show towards the decision makers, and we can find them in respect and honesty. One activity that would be disrespectful to our customer would be to misuse our expertise or position in the company to push and push and push and push for faster and favorable decisions on their part until they finally give in and accept the deliverables that we have provided. Instead, our job is to provide them with the best possible way to ensure that they can review and analyze the project result which we have delivered to ensure that it meets their expectations. On the other hand, it would be disrespectful of them to go and suddenly change their expectations of what they actually wanted here at the last minute. But that is a different story entirely and not covered by the code of ethics. That's just your customer not knowing what they really wanted until you actually show them what you produced. Another unethical and dishonest act would be to withhold information. You and your team are in the thick of the project, so you usually know exactly where you are falling short of the agreed upon criteria. This is the moment when you have to fess up to these issues, which, by the way, is taking ownership of the errors, which would fall under the responsibility standard there at the top left. And now you have to inform the customer of any shortcomings that the deliverables may have, even if that means having to do rework. So you cannot hand a deliverable to your customer and kind of go, well, I know there's an error in it and I'm not going to say anything and I just hope that you won't find it. We're moving on to task 2, which is the transfer of the ownership of deliverables to the assigned stakeholders in accordance with the project plan in order to facilitate project closure. While the PMBOK guide only lightly touches upon the transfer of the ownership, and you'll see that named as the result transition in the close project or phase process, here in the PMP exam content, this activity of the actual transfer is spelled out in detail. And the reason for this is once again because you don't own this project. It is the customer who owns the project result. You created a service or a result for the customer, and now it's time to hand it over. And make sure that you don't fall in love with what you created too much and feel that you now own it, because if that happens, then you cannot do what a project manager should be doing, and that is, you should be moving on to the next project. Once you have this one closed, it's not your responsibility to manage the project result on an ongoing day-to-day basis. Often, this is where project managers who work for small companies learn that this is extremely difficult. You've been handed this great project to make a major change in the company, and once the project end comes, you'll find yourself stuck with running the thing. You have in essence built yourself a departmental job and you are no longer a project manager. The only way to ensure that this doesn't happen, well, you have to plan the transition into the project plan. Identify the actual owner in the planning stage and together with the owner create a transition plan or checklist and get it into their hands at this time now. In regards to the transfer of ownership, I'd like to discuss what we might be doing wrong ethically in the areas of responsibility, respect, and fairness. Part of your responsibility as a project manager is not to begin slacking off at this stage of the project. This is often when our enthusiasm for a project is waning. The project is almost finished and we really just want to get it over with as quickly as possible so that we can move on to newer and greener projects. So do the responsible thing and give your everything also during the transfer. Similarly, you cannot be so disrespectful as to just hand over the project result without any training to the end user. Even though they may have participated in the project all along and seen the result grow, they still need proper training in order to be on the receiving end of the transition. And sticking with the training example, but moving on to fairness, we have to include everyone during the transition. We cannot ignore one group of people just because it may be inconvenient for us to bring them up to speed in this critical phase. Remember, the only reason why you have a job is because the business wanted you to create this new thing. And unless everyone in the business who needs to understand what you have delivered is properly included, then you haven't succeeded. And you probably won't have a job in the future. Task 3. Obtain financial, legal and administrative closure using generally accepted practices in order to communicate formal project closure and ensure no further liability. So, we are in task 3 here in the closing domain, and now finally we are actively closing the project. We are closing the books and budget. We close all contracts, and we also go through our internal administrative closure. And then, very important, we communicate to everyone that the project has been closed. In many companies, standard procedure is that you communicate this to the customer and that the customer signs a letter of acceptance that the project has indeed been closed. The reason for this is that last few words of this task: ensure no further liability. The idea is that you don't want any exposure. You don't want to expose yourself or your company to any claim that may come after the project is long over. For the ethics review, I'd like to read 3 sentences from the Code of Ethics in responsibility, respect, and honesty. In responsibility, that's section 2. We inform ourselves and uphold the policies, rules, regulations and laws that govern our work. This simply means that we have to understand what policies our company has in regards to the various closing activities, and then we have to follow them. Just imagine what might happen if you never received a final sign-off from the customer. In respect, that's section 3 of the code. We negotiate in good faith. During the closing activities, you are going to have to deal with a lot of different folks. Bookkeepers to close the financial side, vendors to close contracts, and many more who have a stake in the project until it is closed. Just like at the start of the project, when you had to negotiate with these people in the opening stages of the project, there may still be some negotiations coming your way. And of course, just like we negotiated in good faith at the onset of the project, we follow the same principles here. In honesty, that is section 5, we provide accurate information in a timely manner. In order to close our project, we will have to provide a lot of information to a number of groups of people, possibly even to the same ones with whom we have to negotiate during closing. Financial numbers, for instance, must be provided in order to facilitate financial closing of the books. Again, it is easy to brush over these requirements and forget to provide them by saying, "Oh, I'll get them to you next week," even though you have no intention of doing so. That is neither honest, nor fair, nor respectful. They have to do their job just as well as you have to do yours, so support them in that. Here is an interesting overview over the 7 tasks in this domain, because you can divide them up into before and after the moment when you actually perform the official closure of the project. Tasks 1 and 2, they are getting final acceptance for your deliverables and transitioning the ownership to the customer. They are before you close. Task 3, that is the actual closure. And then tasks 4 to 7 are what I call the clean-up tasks. They happen after the official project closure. Clean-up task is obviously not their official designation. That's just my way of making it easier for people to understand why we continue to work on a project after task 3 here, in which we perform the closure. I call them clean-up task because of what happens in a restaurant after it closes. Well, your project is now closed. But just like in a restaurant where the doors close at 11 o'clock at night, The employees, they don't just go home. They wipe off the tables, they sweep the floors, they clean the kitchen, they count the tips that they have received, and they set out the placemats for breakfast for the following morning. They get the whole place in ship-shape condition. Same on your project. Even though it is closed in task 3, there is still work to do after the fact. To be precise, there are 4 tasks that we perform after the official closure. Let's look at them. Task 4 is the first one here. Distribute the final project report, including all project closure related information, project variances, and any issues in order to provide the final project status to all stakeholders. So this is the first of these cleanup tasks that you need to know about for the PMP exam. You need to write your final report. Now that everything is said and done, we want to have a final record of the project. Basically, this is our final status update to all the stakeholders. And the fact that we are sending this report to everyone also serves another purpose. It tells them that the project is in fact over. There are stories of some Japanese soldiers who remained vigilant and in battle mode until years after the Second World War had ended, because the news that the war had ended simply never reached them. By sending our final status update, you make an official statement to everyone. This project is over. By including this task into the PMP exam content outline, PMI makes a clear statement. It is our responsibility to write and send this final report, and it would go against our code if you skipped it. Let's also remind ourselves that because this is the final report on the project, it carries weight. This report is what people will often refer back to in order to learn how the project ended. So this becomes our legacy. We have to make sure that we write it in an ethical way. First of all, we have to respect the fact that there will be people who disagree about what goes into this final report. We have to respect their opinions and include both sides of the coin, even if we don't agree with what or how they say it. We would also have to be fair to everyone who worked on the project. Now is not the right moment to stab someone in the back with a badly placed remark regarding their performance. And because this is going to be our legacy on this project, we might be tempted to try and improve the numbers a bit by writing more favorable interpretations alongside the bad figures that our project has produced. Not a good idea. Keep telling the truth even now. We are moving on to task 5, which is to collate lessons learned through comprehensive project review in order to create and or update the organization's knowledge base. By adding this task into the PMP exam content outline, PMI wants to ensure that all the good and bad things that happened on projects don't get lost. It is our responsibility as project managers that we perform a project review to ensure that we don't repeat mistakes. In fact, PMI thinks that performing lessons learned is quite important. In the PMBOK guide, the term lessons learned is mentioned 54 times. Now let's compare this number to another concept that PMI likes very, very, very much, and that is earned value. And you will find that earned value is mentioned 60 times. So lessons learned in the PMBOK guide just as important as earned value. And why is that? Because the concept behind the PMBOK guide and the content in the PMP exam is trying to promote PMI's vision, making project management indispensable for business results, and pushing our organization towards being a learning organization is definitely part of the plan here. We are moving straight on to task 6, but don't worry, we're going to do a combined ethics review of tasks 5 and 6 in just a couple of slides. So, task 6, archive project documents and material in order to retain organizational knowledge, comply with statutory requirements, and ensure availability of data for potential use in future projects and internal, external audits. The first part of this task helps our organization to become a learning organization. File the project documents together with the lessons learned and you will become a learning organization. This task, by the way, is one of the few tasks in which it is clearly spelled out that it is our responsibility to do this task, because there may be rules and regulations governing our work that require us to do so. These rules could be internal or external, so there is already a bit of ethics involved here. We have to do this task in order to comply with it. And the final result of all of this gathering and documenting is, of course, the document archive. As promised, let's take a look at the ethics implication for both tasks 5 and 6, and we begin with task 5 for responsibility and respect. Just like it is our responsibility to do a project review and collate these lessons learned at the end of a project, it is also our responsibility to open up lessons learned files at the start of a new project. So use your company's lessons learned files to help your project to be more successful at the start of the project. In regards to respect, when we talk about respect on a project, respecting people, then we usually have the boundary here of the project. The project has a beginning, has an end, and everybody who is somehow involved between the beginning and the end, we have to respect them. But here's an extension to this thinking. Creating lessons learned as part of task 5 here is a sign of our respect to fellow project managers in the company. It is a professional courtesy to figure out and document what went right and what went wrong, and therefore keeping record of it for our respected colleagues. Now let's move on to task 6, which was archiving all the documents. While it may already be too late at this time, it is still a good practice to reflect on your own behavior as you are going through all the accumulated project documents. Of course, we do this much more regularly throughout the project as well, because the Code of Ethics requires us to, and I quote, re-examine our impartiality and objectivity, taking corrective action as appropriate. So this here is really one of the last moments when we can sit down and critically examine ourselves and ask, was everything that we did fair? Lastly, we have honesty. Task 6 says that we gather and archive all of these documents, also for the fact that there might be future audits coming our way. In my view, while passing an audit successfully often depends much on the personal interpretation on the facts by the auditor, the best thing that we can do as project managers is to prepare and honestly report and archive everything that shows how we acted and managed the project. And if one of these documents shows that we did indeed make a mistake, well then that takes us back to the responsibility. We will archive this document even if it shows that we didn't do things exactly the way we should have. That is our responsibility. And here is our very last task, task 7. Measure customer satisfaction at the end of the project by capturing customer feedback in order to assist in project evaluation and enhance customer relationships. For the interpretation of this task, let me ask you the following question. Why do we do projects? We certainly don't do them because we think it's a great idea. At least normally we don't. Normally we do projects because a customer or a sponsor is of the opinion that the business would profit from receiving the benefits from the project's results. That's why. It is therefore a good practice for us to return to the customer once the project has been completed and ask them, so how did we do? Was the project executed to your satisfaction? Is there anything that we can do better next time? And of course, this next time is also an important reason why we do this. By asking the customer what went right and what went wrong, we make sure that they understand that we are learning from our mistakes. Keep doing the good stuff, and that in doing so, we are improving our processes and approach with each project. This shows our customer focus and the fact that we are a service-oriented organization towards them. This is a task that is aimed at people. So in regards to ethics, here are the people-oriented actions and reactions that might occur, and we should be able to handle them ethically. Responsibility. It is easy to sit down with a customer after a successful project and obtain their feedback. It is much harder to do so on a failed project. However, it is our responsibility to reach out and capture the feedback. In a small way, this may even help salvage some of the trust that the customer has probably lost. Respect. Let's continue with the failed project idea, and let's assume that the feedback session with the customer is not going well at all. Bad words are flying and tempers are rising. However, as professionals, we will not reciprocate and still treat the other side with courtesy, because the code tells us that we conduct ourselves in a professional manner, even if it is not reciprocated. Fairness. The reason why we measure customer satisfaction is to receive open and honest feedback from them. But who should see this feedback? Should we keep it to ourselves, distribute it only to senior management, or the whole team? The Code of Ethics is quite clear. We provide equal access to information to those who are authorized to have that information. So let's make the customer feedback available to everyone. If, of course, there is sensitive information in the data, we grant access to the data based on authorization level. Honesty. This was the last time that we went through the list of the 4 ethics standards as part of our review of the PMP exam content. The very last standard to look at is honesty in relation to obtaining customer feedback. So let's discuss the following statement from the code. We strive to create an environment in which others feel safe to tell the truth. You might say that it's probably a bit late at this stage of the game to begin worrying about this. After all, the project is over and now you suddenly want me to create an environment that fosters openness and truth? Quite right. It would be way too late to start this now, and that is the reason why I haven't mentioned this before, and also the point that I am making here. In this presentation, I was able to wait with this particular item until right now. But on a real project, you cannot. Creating an environment that fosters honesty starts at the very beginning of the project. Don't wait, like I just have, until the end. Plan on creating an environment of trust from the very start of your project. And that's it. We have reviewed the 7 tasks here in the domain 5, closing the project. Here they are again. We begin by obtaining acceptance of our deliverables, and then we start the transfer. This, as we have seen earlier on, is before the actual closure. Then we obtain closure, and obviously this is the moment of closure. But we're not done here, because just like in a restaurant, we're now moving up to the what I call cleanup tasks. We have some final reporting to do, there are lessons learned to gather, we have to archive the documents, and we also have to measure the customer satisfaction. And by the way, since these were the last 7 tasks that we reviewed from the PMP exam content outline, I wanted to emphasize that even though we show these tasks in sequence at the end of each lesson, they are of course not necessarily executed in this exact sequence. For instance, it's more likely that measuring the customer satisfaction actually happens before or as part of the gathering of lessons learned. Until next time.